If your creative push has helped you on your creative journey, consider helping the show by becoming a patron. Patrons get access to episodes and YouTube videos the week before they're released, and they also find out about and get to ask questions to upcoming guests before I interview them. For $1, $5, or $10 a month, you can give back to the show and help me help more creative people like you who need the push. Thank you so much to my existing patrons, and thank you for considering to help the cause. And either way, on behalf of the universe, thank you for listening and creating. Your Creative Push, episode 342.
You could be the best artist on the planet, but if you're only drawing in your bedroom and never showing anybody, you basically don't exist.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and my guest today is Dan Berry. Dan is a cartoonist, illustrator, podcaster, and educator from the United Kingdom, and since 2012 he has produced the podcast Make It, Then Tell Everybody, in which he has spoken to over 150 other artists about what they do and how they do it. And he comes on the show today to share his journey, his journey as an artist, his journey as a podcaster, his journey as an educator, his journey as a cartoonist, and all of the ups and downs that have occurred to him along the way. He tells the story of when he was hospitalized from the extreme stress that he experienced working, and the knowledge that that gave him about stress moving forward, and how everyone has different responses to stress, and the value of being able to determine your own. We talk about the large amount of work that you can get done in 1 hour and the stress level of effort and half-assing it to aim for a B grade instead of an A. He discusses why he called his podcast Make It, Then Tell Everybody to illuminate the, quote, grubby underbelly of the creative process. Dan shares the importance of telling people about your work, both your old work and your new work, and how he gets past page fright, the fear of the blank page. Dan also talks about the experience of drawing an entire comic in 24 hours and other forms of stunt drawing, how he interacts with his ideas, and why he's wary of the ones that come into his head fully formed, and finally, and maybe most importantly, why he draws people as birds. Dan was such a pleasure to talk to. He's a very thoughtful, insightful, and funny guy, and I love the way that he thinks about not just the creative process, but how the creative process relates to life. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Dan Berry. Dan, welcome to Your Creative Push, man.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, by listening to your podcast, I already feel like I kind of know you. And then just talking to you for like 5 minutes, I feel like we're already friends. So I'm really excited to bring your energy and your humor and everything else to this podcast. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. It's a genuine treat.
No, my pleasure. So at the top of the show, I always like to give my guests the opportunity to sort of lay the groundwork and tell the audience sort of who you are and how you got to the point you are, creatively speaking.
Yeah. Okay. So what's the way to start this? I've always been one of these kids that would like draw and like take things apart and try and put them back together. So if I'd get like a radio controlled car for my birthday when I was like 12, I'd drive it around for 20 minutes and then I'd spend the rest of the day taking it apart and putting it back together and trying to find out how it worked. That's always been the sort of defining characteristic, I think, of what I do. I'm curious. My university degree was in multimedia design in the early 2000s, and that got me really interested in the process of design, making things, design almost as like a mind control thing, where by just placing these elements on a page or on a screen, you can make someone think something or feel something or want to do something. Makes me sound quite sinister, but it was fascinating to me. We had one of the texts that they set as like a key text was Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which, if you don't know it, it's an excellent primer, first of all, in how comics work, but also semiotics and representation and what images mean and how they work with text and, the transition between images and then the gaps that we fill in for ourselves. That was absolutely fascinating to me. And being a kid who'd always drawn, and, you know, I grew up reading Asterix and Tintin and things like that. Putting those things together, that idea of how do you make something appear in someone's mind by the arrangement of pictures on a page, with the idea of telling stories as well. That's always fascinated me. So I started drawing comics, and when I started, they were awful, they were terrible, and no one will ever see them. They're dreadful. And then very, very slowly over time, I got better. I took jobs as a designer. Eventually, I got a part-time job working teaching in the university I went to, and eventually they asked me to apply for a job. They were starting a degree course in comics. This is back in 2007, 2008. Would I be interested in helping out? I think they wanted me as like a technical capacity first, because I knew Photoshop. And so I applied for the job and I got it. And then enough people retired, moved on, that I sort of climbed the ladder slowly but surely until I was running the department. So I taught in university for 11 years, teaching comics and illustration. And last year I quit the job. I didn't feel that my quality of life was particularly good. I wasn't feeling particularly creatively fulfilled, and I think it was affecting my health and well-being. So now I'm a freelance cartoonist. And here we are.
100% freelance?
Yeah, I've got no steady source of income. Is that the definition of a freelancer?
Congratulations.
I'm adrift in a sea of possibility.
No. I love it. Well, yeah, and I've heard you talk about that in the podcast too, about the quitting the teaching. And I was wondering if you could get into the mindset of that. Maybe tell a story about how, like, what led up to that. As you said, like, it was stressing you out and, affecting you negatively. And I think that a lot of people that listen to this podcast can at least somewhat relate to that, at least sometimes in their life, where, you know, the job is taking away completely, where it's like you have no time or no energy or no willpower or no like kind of creative drive for all the other stuff that you used to love. So could you talk about that kind of phase of Dan's life?
Well, I think it's like a two-part story. So I took this job as a designer, sort of a lead designer working for a viral marketing agency. So I'd finished my degree. I was working towards my master's and I'd ran out of money. So I thought I need to get a job to earn some money. So I took the first job that came along. And really, I should have done my research. The company I worked for was dreadful. The working conditions was awful. The boss was a lunatic. There's no other way to describe it.
Yeah,
it was a bad situation to be in. So I found myself working 90 hours a week for multiple clients, and I'd get shouted at if I left the building to take a lunch break. So it wasn't a healthy environment. So the stress was sort of building up. And then one day I felt like someone had sort of snuck up behind me in the office and smashed me around the back of the head with a baseball bat or something. It was an incredible pain. It was very, very sudden. There was no one there. It was just this incredible headache that just arrived, and it didn't leave for 6 months. So I got taken into hospital and they did brain scans, and they said, "Nee, your brain's fine, but just maybe calm down a little bit. Just take it a little bit slower, maybe." But of course, I was quite young, and I didn't realize that this is what stress is. I thought, "Ooh, headaches. These are things that just happen to people." So I went back to work, and one day I had this, this permanent headache that wouldn't leave, and then I had these like pins and needles in my hands and feet, and I felt really faint and dizzy, and like my heart was pounding. I was thinking, this isn't normal. So I rung up the NHS sort of helpline and explained the symptoms, and they said, "Okay, place the phone back in the receiver, dial an ambulance, and get yourself straight to hospital, or you might die." And I was thinking, oh, great. So I ended up going into hospital. And so it was a mixture of having labyrinthitis, which is like an inner ear sort of vertigo thing, with having a panic attack because I was so stressed, and, it sort of all compounded into one thing, where they thought I was having a heart attack. And so they said, you must take it easy. This job isn't good for you. You should quit. So I did. And I took like temp jobs for a while. And then this job teaching came up. I'd done a little teaching before, and I quite enjoyed it. So I took this job. And it was a good job. We wrote this degree in comics, and we ran it for, over a decade. And it was good and fun. It was a really good, fun job, up until the point where it wasn't. because the higher I got promoted, the less teaching I got to do, and the more of the sort of backstage politics I'd have to deal with, which was, I mean, it's not enjoyable, and I don't think anyone truly enjoys that. Well, I didn't, certainly.
No.
But then I started having these headaches again. I thought they were migraines, and it was getting to the point where these migraines would last sort of 80 plus hours at a time. So going to the doctors and getting this investigated and realizing that my blood pressure was incredibly high, due to stress. And I figured that something had to change. It was the choice between carrying on doing a job and, becoming miserable and unwell, or jumping out of it and doing something different. I found that with teaching, and a lot of the colleagues that I worked with, it had a tendency to trap you into thinking it was the only thing you could do. So when we'd have conversations about what would you do if you lost your job, for example, people would say, well, I can't do anything else. I don't know anything else. And I remember feeling that was a really strange way of thinking about it, because teaching is such a compound skill, because it's not just blowing information at someone, it's also understanding how they're going to read into that information, what their motivations are, things like your tone of voice, the way that you present the information. You had to be a counsellor, you had to be a politician, you had to be an expert in your field, you had to be tech support, you had to be kind of everything all at the same time. And I remember thinking that your teaching isn't one job. You should be able to take this job apart and see the different strands that you can then go and work in. And I'd been working as a cartoonist sort of alongside teaching as well. And that was becoming difficult. I've got 2 young children and a wife and cats at home. And trying to balance, being a parent and a husband and a cat owner, in that order, obviously. It was becoming difficult. And so I figured that I'll make a change. I mean, the worst that can happen is that it doesn't work, and I'll take a job. I've got, compound skills, like we said. So far it seems to be going okay.
Do you feel like that first part of your story where you were hospitalized at that first job was like, it gave you sort of like a, not superpower, obviously, but like kind of a way to have a litmus test for stress?
Yeah.
Obviously getting a 80-hour headache isn't a good thing, but at least you're able to kind of know that your body is telling you, okay, this might not be right, or something needs to change.
The benefit in having that, awful experience of that job, being hospitalized and, being thoroughly miserable at the time, it's very easy to get sort of overwhelmed by misery. I think we can all agree on that
100%. Amen, brother.
And, I try and stay positive. And so I think, what are the things that I can take away from this? And I think it gave me a clearer understanding of how my body responds to stress. I think stress sort of seeps out of people's physicality in strange ways. People might tidy up, or they might move things around, or they might throw themselves into one aspect of their job, or, completely ignore another one. And so everyone has a slightly different response to stress. And so I found that I would start making small mistakes and I would get enormous headaches. And that was my indicator for stress. So that was a positive to take out of it. But this sort of absolutely manic pace that we had to work at in that job taught me how much I could get done in an hour, like how long an hour is, what you can fit into it if you just sit down and do it. I think I'm a sort of natural procrastinator. I'm easily distracted, and being able to have that sort of proof, if you sit down and just do this, one day you can get all of this work done. That was really, really valuable. And those are the things that I want to sort of take away from, any of these sort of stressful experiences, is a better understanding of what might happen in the future, but also what I can do about it.
Right. And you mentioned procrastination and getting distracted. So when you're actually doing the work that you enjoy, maybe it does lead to some stress eventually, but, doing comics and freelance work, what other kind of things maybe rear their ugly head, maybe that don't give you a headache, but maybe that you need to kind of attack your resistances?
Well, it's a weird thing. Like I was talking about this with someone the other day. I feel like for a long time I denied myself sort of pleasures. I would think, I would love to do this, or I'd love to do that, and I wouldn't, because I think, well, no, I've got stuff to do. And so I spent a long time being very firm in my work ethic. So, I mean, when I was working on my last book, called The 3 Rooms in Valerie's Head with David Gaffney, I had maybe 3 or 4 months to draw 120 pages, which was rather a heavy workload. So I was getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and doing, an hour or two's drawing before I went to work, and then working from sort of the whole day, getting home, putting the kids to bed, and then working through till midnight, and then doing the same. And that was a hellish 3 months, but the book got done, and I'm very happy with it. So I think now I try to take a more wholesome approach to procrastination. I know that there are things I must do, and there's things I'd like to do. So I try and get the things that I must do out of the way first. And then if I do have this odd urge to buy a canoe and paddle up the river, then I'll do that as well. But it won't take priority. I did that. That's literally what I did.
You did go up the river?
Yeah. Well, down. It's much easier to go down the river. Yeah.
So that was one of the pleasures that you were denying yourself for a long time, huh?
Yeah. And it's quite nice to sort of step back from the obligations that you set for yourself, and understand that you do have these freedoms in the way that you can live your life. That was a big thing for me. Working as a lecturer for so long, you have to, like I said, you have to fill these many different roles. And it sort of boils down to this respectability that you need to have as an educator. You need to be respected, or at least trusted. And so I would avoid things that would undermine that trust or respect. Things like buying a canoe and paddling it up or down a river, which is bonkers now I think about it. There's no real reason that would diminish any aspect of responsibility or trust. But I think you trick yourself into these things. And I don't know why that is. So it's been an interesting year, learning more about myself and how I think and how I work, and giving myself a little bit more permission to be happy, I think.
Well, congratulations. And I think that's something that, like, a skill that every person tries to develop. And when you see it in somebody else, it's one of those, like, obvious things.
Yeah.
Like, the teaching was you were getting too many responsibilities, and it was getting too stressful for you. Of course you should quit and whatever. But when you're actually in that situation, it's like the other teachers were kind of talking about, like, well, what else would I do? Because that's the narrative that you've been telling yourself for so long. It's like this path that I've chosen, and I must go down it, and I can't stray from it. And then I can't get too silly by buying a canoe, and I got to, like, maintain this persona, and I can't, my personal work has to be this certain way, and I can't, do something different. It seems so obvious from the outside, but sometimes it does take those, like, major life events like you had early on to kind of have that awareness for yourself, and then to actually take action on it, which is a scary thing to do, but very, very necessary.
Yeah, and there's also this sort of weird macho masochistic element to it as well when you're denying it. One of the things that I know was said, as I was leaving the job was like, well, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. You think, well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Why if you were boiling would you stay there?
Right.
There's the really strange macho aspect to it that's unhealthy. It's frankly unhealthy. And one of the things I used to talk to my students about is, lots of people would come in with this attitude that they must work all-nighters. If they're not pulling all-nighters, they're really not passionate. You've got to live, eat, sleep, breathe it, and absolutely devour your subject. You've got to live it 100% all of the time. Otherwise, you're doing yourself a disservice. And that is the most toxic, poisonous nonsense that you can talk about with creativity, because it's not a muscle that you can just flex. It's also a gland, and you've got to relax it. And so I would tell the students, you've got to half-ass it, but you've got to half-ass it so consistently. So half-ass it from 9:30 in the morning until 3:30, and you'll get loads done. You have a point at which effort becomes stress. And so if you're working within an achievable level of effort, it doesn't become stressful. You've got that level to move into. You can move into that stress level of effort as the graph goes up. But if you're working at a stress level, like all the time, all you're going to do is burn yourself out. And if you're working at a very, very low effort, you're not going to achieve much. So working at this half-ass level of effort, but consistently, taking evenings and weekends off will allow you that space to, fill with, extra effort as and when it arrives. But you don't overtax yourself. So I'd say, aim for a B grade. Don't aim for an A, because that's like, it's hard, it's difficult, and these are self-imposed boundaries that we put on ourselves.
Isn't that funny though, that I completely agree with you, by the way. Like, it doesn't have to be, 100% like pedal to the metal at all times, because that is like the surest way to burn yourself out. But
Absolutely.
Also you need that downtime for like that incubation period for your ideas to kind of come in. Or also, I just took a long break, like 7-month break from the podcast, because I was getting burnout, just doing it week after week after week. And I wanted to quit. Like, I was thinking about quitting the podcast. I was like, just because that's where my mindset was.
Yeah.
And then, taking that long of a break, now I'm like more stoked out of my mind than I ever have been. So you need that downtime. You need that, like you said, half-assed. But I think it's funny because people say half-assed, but it's really just finding a balance. It's just having a balanced life.
Yes. Yeah. I think that the half-assed, maybe some people might interpret it incorrectly, but I had the exactly the same experience with my podcast. So I would beat myself up if I missed a week, and I started my podcast in 2012. So it's been going a fairly long time now. And this was, I don't remember any other podcasts having seasons back then. It was just your weekly show, like forever.
Yeah.
And now I'm looking at these podcasts where they're like, I'm going to do 11 episodes and then stop for a year. I'm thinking, why can't I do that?
Yeah. Yep.
But I would, get so stressed with work and workload and everything else that was going on. And I think I managed to convince myself that everything else was stressful apart from the thing that actually was. So, drawing comics, that's actually very stressful. I need to just put that on a back burner for a while. Or the podcast, it's very stressful talking to very nice people for an hour each week. Very stressful indeed. And so I'd trick myself into thinking that things that weren't stressful were stressful, sort of avoiding the real topic. But recording a podcast is lovely. It's absolutely wonderful. But you're right, you do need some space occasionally to let your mind sort of relax back into a more plastic state, so it can get back and do it again.
Definitely, 100%, man. Amen. Preach.
Well, testify.
Because I did want to talk about the podcast, and I think the thing that initially, I was in preparing for this interview trying to remember how I found you. And I think it was just the title of your podcast, because it's like something that it's like a mantra that I've said on many of the episodes, and many of my guests have said. It's like and I don't want to speak for you, but maybe could you tell me kind of why did you title your podcast Make It and then Tell Everybody?
So the sort of genesis of the podcast, I was asked to host some panel discussions at a comics festival in Birmingham in 2012. And there was going to be an exhibition in a local sort of coffee shop art place nearby. And so what I wanted to do was exhibit some people's work. So the sort of rough preparatory work and then the stages between actual line work all the way up to the finished actual thing that you saw. I always felt a bit cheated by art when you would go into a gallery or pick up a book or look at something and you'd see this beautiful, perfect, pristine thing. And you go, how does someone just do that? That's impossible. That's one of those things that I can't just do. I remember beating myself up quite firmly about it because I couldn't do that. And I remember going to an exhibition of like original artwork and seeing all of the different ways that people screwed it up. There's whiteout on this, and there's a panel pasted over that, and there's an obvious line that's been erased there. And that sort of glimpse at the grubby underbelly of it was fascinating and exhilarating, because you realize that it's okay to make mistakes. It's a bit like watching, these incredible sprinters like run 100 meters in like 9 seconds or something. How does anyone just do that? And the trick is they don't just do that. There's so much preparation and planning and training, boring stuff that goes into it, running every day, eating right, that we don't ever see. And so I wanted the sort of make it aspect to be illuminating. I wanted it to be useful in some way, to talk to people about how it gets put together and how there isn't really such a thing as normal. Abnormal is just doing it. That's a bit weird. And then the sort of the make it side of it, I'm fascinated with. But the thing I struggled with at the time is, how do you actually get people to understand that? How do you tell everybody about it? I would do a run of this zine that I did, and I'd sell 50 of them, and I would be so pleased that I sold 50 of them. And then I would think about the population of the planet, and I think, well, of these, 7.5, 8 billion people, what is that as a percentage? Like, there's so many people that haven't seen it. How do I get a broader audience? How do I, market myself? So that idea, taking those two ideas, is essentially the process of being an indie cartoonist, is, making it and then telling people what you do, and whether that person is, an agent or a publisher or, the world at large. You could be the best artist on the planet, but if you're only drawing in your bedroom and never showing anybody, you basically don't exist. So compounding those two ideas together gave me a format and a structure to start chatting to people about how they do what they do.
Right. And do you think are they two independent statements, like make it and then tell everybody? Or like what's like for you personally, like as you're doing your work and maybe like based off of some of your conversations, should there be a separation there? Like what should your mindset be as you're making it? Because you mentioned before that just that desire to create something, and then that thing that you created appears in somebody else's mind. Like, are you thinking about that when you're making your comics, or are you thinking about, how do I get 1 million people to see this, or what is that like?
I mean, it's a bit. I mean, it's a real oversimplification to say that this is the formula. Make it and then tell everyone, and then you're famous and you're very wealthy. Because if it was that easy, my goodness, that would be great. Obviously, there's huge overlaps, and I think one of the things that I've noticed about working on comics is, because they can take quite a long time, months at a time to draw things. If you're working on a graphic novel, the one I'm working on at the moment, I feel like I've been on for maybe 2 or 3 years now, and it's slowly coming together. This is the year it gets finished, so I'm quite excited about that. But while you're working on this singular project, it's, especially if you can't share what you're doing as well, maybe it's not quite appropriate to share this just yet in terms of spoilers or publishing schedules or what have you. I always had this feeling that unless you were constantly feeding the social media machine, people would assume that your avatar had died. Your persona as an artist had become a sort of flopping corpse that didn't do anything. What a vision. Sorry for that.
I love it.
So the idea of making it and then telling everybody is an oversimplification, because there has to be an element of reminding people that you're alive. And it can't just be, that simple, like do this and then do that. There's obviously you have to make something and tell everybody almost concurrently and consistently, and give people other reminders as to why you exist and why you're relevant and what they can be excited about. So I'm always trying to find little ways to remind people what I do, that I exist, that there are things that I create that they can either buy or read or experience or listen to. And it gets to the point where, if I've done a big push on online sales, so, I've had a sale on my store in January, and I feel like every 4 hours I've tweeted about it or done something about it. And I'm thinking, everyone must be absolutely sick of me. Imagine you were stood in a room with someone, and every 4 hours someone stood on a chair and said, look at me and listen to me for, 40 minutes. You'd be sick of that obnoxious jerk. And that's the way it feels. But again, the social media is it's a rolling conveyor belt that carries away these things, and then they're never to be seen again. People's attention span is very brief on social media, and so you do have to sort of oversaturate it to the point where it feels awkward to you. But I remember I make pens as well, And I feel like all I do is go on about them. And occasionally someone who I've, followed on Twitter for a long time will go, "Oh, wow, I didn't know you made pens." I'm thinking, I've been stood here screaming at the top of my lungs.
Have you listened to me?
I've just been shouting and shouting, what's going on? And so it's so easy just to let it gloss over you. And so that idea of staying alive and present and visible is something I think about quite a lot.
Right. And I think especially when you're trying to make money from it, or whether it's, you're trying to make it your career, or you're just trying to maybe pay the bills, at least your creative bills for supplies or, website hosting or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
If that's something that you've made important, then actually keep it important. And just because, it takes you a little bit of time to like build that, first of all, build that audience, but second of all, to kind of monetize it and get people to, yes, pay attention. And I know, like, for you, you're on Twitter, and you see every tweet, but, like, your audience is only probably seeing, like, 10% of your tweets. So for you, it might feel ridiculous, but you have to, like, look out for number one first. And even if that means standing up. Hey, and you know what? I have been to parties where people basically stand on a chair and say the same thing over and over again about themselves. So it's not that weird.
Have we been at the same parties?
Yeah, man.
Was that me?
No, it was that guy Barry. You know Barry?
Oh, Den Barry. Yeah, I hate him. But I think that there's something, I don't know, I think the word is inelegant. There's something inelegant about asking for money that I don't know if this is just, sort of my upbringing or my relationship to money, but I've always found it very difficult to talk to people about money or ask for money or chase up an invoice or give someone a price. And I have to sort of remove my ego and the part of my brain that understands what I'm saying. I have to sort of remove that from myself and then give the figure or say, please give me some money because I'd love to pay my mortgage and feed my children this month. But it always feels inelegant. And I have this feeling that people have become accustomed to the idea that if it's on the internet, it's for free. Certainly, things like, dumb things like typefaces. A good typeface is expensive. I make typefaces as well, and when I make a custom typeface, it's not cheap. But I feel that there's always this attitude that if it's on a computer, if it's a file, it's free. This movie, I should be able to just download it. This TV, Game of Thrones, I should be able to just have Game of Thrones. And so I think that when you're trying to operate online, that's the attitude that you have to work against. The sort of the idea that it should be free. And it's not a 100% everyone thinks this, but it's this attitude that I feel that, asking for money, are you? Or why can't I get this for free? I had one of my books pirated once, and I wrote a thing on my blog about, it's very nice to be flattered by someone stealing my work. However, and I had, comments on Twitter saying, haha, loser, you've just told us where to find it. Okay, cool. That's cool. Thanks very much.
Was that Dead Barry again?
That guy. God, I hate him so much.
Well, I think it's not just people not wanting to pay and people assuming that everything should be free. It's like the immediacy of things too. And like a paywall isn't even about the money all the time. It's just about one more step for them to get that thing immediately.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like, it's like trying to find ways to make that process as easy as possible. Like one click if possible.
Yeah. Reducing barriers. I think generally humans, when they feel like they're not being watched, are lazy. Generally, I know I am. If I have the option to walk up a hill or down a hill, I'm going to walk downhill because it's easier. And the easiest thing to do is nothing at all. So when you get presented with a slight barrier, certainly online, I'm not doing this. When a GDPR thing pops up, or we use cookies, dismiss this, look at our ads for flights to Hawaii that pop up. It's all those things that add up and just frustrate you. And it's so easy just to do nothing, which is not carry on. And so giving people that incentive to want to, support an indie cartoonist or a podcaster is tough. It's not an easy ask, especially when it's a thing that you're by and large giving away for free anyway.
Right.
I mean, you must have felt this as well. I mean, there's no sort of subscription with your podcast. There's no, well, certainly with mine as well, there's no app that says you must pay, $6.99 a month to get all this premium content. The podcast is and always will be just a free thing that I give away. So I often think, how do you make money from something that you give away for free?
That is the big question. And I've been in my hiatus, like coming back, I was like, all right, well, let me get a sponsor so that not just like not to have money for myself, but like then I can use that money to pay an editor so that I can, save 3 or 4 hours for each episode that I can then devote to either more episodes or like I'm trying to push my YouTube channel now and do videos and stuff like that. Then that presents a big problem. And now I'm back to square one. This whole thing that I preach about, just reach out, keep reaching out to people. First it was to get guests on the podcast. And then it was for people listening to like collaborate with somebody, or if you want to get in a show or a gallery or whatever, just keep pushing. And like if you get rejections or you get ghosted, just keep going. Now I'm going through that process with trying to get advertisers, and now I feel like I've built this podcast that I think has a great message, and I have a fairly decent audience. Yet it feels so when nobody responds to you or companies don't want to be a part of that or partner with you, it's like, all right, well, like, what is this meaningless? Like, does this mean nothing? So, it's tough to find a way to monetize, especially when you're somebody like me who, when I was living in an apartment, my downstairs neighbor was in a tough time and he was, selling his furniture. I asked him how much for that coffee table, and he said, $20. And I was like, I'll give you 40. Like, I'm that kind of mindset. So it's tough. It's tough out there for creatives.
It is, and I think one of the things I think I learned fairly early on, I had a sort of weird string of things that strung together, and I think that they kind of taught me a lesson. I did a couple of like indie comics, I did like little sort of zines, essentially, short, funny little things that got something noticed, and then someone, asked me to do something, and so my sort of, I'm going to use inverted quotes here, fame. It's not fame at all. It was notoriety, if anything, like would increase ever so slightly. And I had this belief that any growth in my career, it had to come from outside. I remember when I was a kid, I had this BMX bike, and I was convinced, 100% convinced, that if I, rode around my garden, and then when I got to the driveway, the top of the driveway, if I popped a wheelie right at the top of the driveway, there'd be like the owner of some speedway coming around in his limousine, and he'd see this kid like popping a wheelie in his driveway and go, "Kid, you're our ace. You're our racer. We're going to have you our number one. You're going to ride BMX for the big leagues, boy." And I, had obviously convinced myself that this was absolutely true. But I was riding around the garden on a red BMX. That was it. There's no limousine. There was no one coming around to actually say anything. Of course there wasn't. But I felt that early on in my sort of creative career, I thought that, again, that was how it was supposed to happen. You were supposed to sort of diligently do things, and then someone would notice, and waggle their cigar, "Kid, you've hit the big leagues," that sort of thing. And I don't think that it's never happened to me. Maybe there is someone out there who's been like discovered or found, or there's been some sort of rags to riches story with a generous billionaire benefactor taking, and that's not true. That doesn't happen. So I had this string of events where I'd asked to be to contribute to this comics anthology that then led on to a different job, that then led on to a book, that then sort of coincided with me playing this video game, that then I got in touch with the musician Jim Guthrie asked me to do a music video, so I did that music video, and then that music video was seen by someone who asked me to do this job for someone else, and then it sort of clicked in my head like, oh right, I can't just wait for it to happen to me. I've got to go and ask for people to do something. And so I've become, I think, immune to the effects of asking for things, pitching and saying, I would like to do this. Would you send me to this place to do this thing? Wouldn't it be great if you invited me to somewhere and we did something together? And it is galling. It hurts your heart to actually, open your mouth and say those words. And sometimes people say yes. Oftentimes people go, "That's not happening. We're not doing that at all." But occasionally someone will say yes. And I think that there's very few champions for you. That you might find an organization or a person or a sponsor or someone who wants to take that bet on you. And that's an incredibly privileged position to be in. I think for the rest of the time, it is just pitching and getting out there. And I think, what they call it, the hustle, hustling and asking. That's really important. And there's an element of swallowing your pride and getting used to standing on that chair and shouting at that party. I think there's ways to do it elegantly and there's ways to do it inelegantly. And I think it sort of depends on your personality, by and large.
100%. And the BMX bike story is so.
Did you have a BMX?
I did, and I was like, oh, like I had the same type of feeling, like, yeah, they'll find me, like. But I think people really truly have that feeling that they're going to put something on the internet, and that advertiser or that person that wants to work with them or that gallery, like they're out there scouring the internet and they have like 100 like internet sleuths looking for like undiscovered talent. That's not really how it works, but I think we all kind of have that story that we fantasy. Tell ourselves, that fantasy, because we've heard about people, they got discovered, this comedian got discovered at this club and this singer got discovered there, and some people do build successful careers based off of that one lucky break, but so much of it, not just putting yourself out there and not being afraid, like you said, to plug yourself or to ask for something from somebody else. It's not just getting those opportunities in that way, but it's also building your audience. Like your audience isn't necessarily out there looking for the next greatest person that nobody has ever seen. You kind of have to put that paper in front of them, put your book in front of them, like in front of their eyes, and then see if it sticks. And if it sticks, then you've got a new audience member. But like you kind of have to be proactive about building that yourself as well.
But there's also, I think, there's an element I found, certainly with books, I think that, like I said, the book I was published beginning of 2018, The 3 Rooms in Valerie's Head. It was written with a writer called David Gaffney. It was published by Top Shelf. And I think I finished drawing it in like the end of 2015, I think, or thereabouts. And so it was a long journey to actually get through to publication. There was issues with the distributor that sort of held it up. And then it came out. And trying to remain enthusiastic about something that isn't representative of your current level of ability can be difficult. And that's not to say that, oh gosh, I hate that book. Oh, it looks awful. It was dreadful. Oh, I couldn't draw back then. I'm absolutely fine with it. But when you're presented with old work, and you know what you can do now, and then you've got to sort of publicize it and market it and sort of almost slap on a fake smile and go, this is great. Come and buy this great book. It's fresh to you, but it's stale to me. Right. That's an exaggeration, obviously, but sort of retaining the enthusiasm you have once you've sort of completed something. Because again, for the rest of the population of the planet, this is a brand new experience to them. It's as new to them as it was to you. But, familiarity, I think, can breed contempt in a lot of ways. And so finding elements within the work that you can stay enthusiastic about and stay excited about and try and transmit that excitement and enthusiasm onto someone else, it is challenging. It is difficult.
Now, is that something that you've discovered with, over 150 people now that you've talked to?
I think this week I recorded the 168th episode.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
is that like a lesson that you've taken from other creators as well, like that you've kind of seen, where it's like, the old work isn't necessarily stale, but like as creatives, oftentimes, like the thing that we're currently working on is the thing that we're most excited about. So is it sort of a formula where it's like, all right, make it, then tell everyone, then make something else, then tell everyone else about that? Like, does it have to
and then come back to the first thing and carry on?
Yeah.
Proclaiming its greatness about that one as well.
Right.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I've spoken to quite a few people. I mean, lots of people have imposter syndrome, where they're like, I don't belong here. Everyone else is doing it properly, and I'm not. I'm the odd one out at this party. Everyone else has stood on a chair, and I'm sat on the floor. This is the worst day of my life. And I think everyone has this sort of deep, dark secret that they secretly harbor, that they're doing it wrong, and they're just waiting for someone to point out, like, they're using Photoshop in the wrong way, or, my goodness, did you see that they're on Windows 8? goodness me, what is going on? That was drawn on an iPad. That's cheating. All of these like weird lies that people tell themselves about the work. And, if it exists, you've done it right. That's what I think. I remember talking to the illustrator, Jonathan Edwards, who's a good friend of mine and wonderful, wonderful illustrator, just fantastic. And he'll blush to hear me say this. But he was saying to me that he would look at some of his old work, say 6 months had passed, and he'd look at something he'd done 6 months ago and go, why can't I do that now? Why was that good? And what I'm doing right now, why is that terrible? And I think everyone's got this ability to, look at their own work and see the flaws in it. But he would look at old work and think, God, I've lost it because why can't I do that anymore? And then 6 months would pass and he would look at that work and go, that was really good. I can't do that now though. And so there was always this sort of 6 month gap between liking and disliking something. And he said that he thought it's because you've forgotten what the picture was supposed to look like. Immediately when you're drawing a picture, if it doesn't match the picture you had in your head, then you've done it wrong. And you get this sense of dissatisfaction from it. Oh, this is dreadful. 6 months pass, you go to sleep, you eat dinner, do the things you need to do in your life, and you forget about what it was supposed to look like. And you return to this picture and go, it was actually pretty good. Because you see it for what it is and not what it was supposed to be. And you forget that no one else has the access to that first picture that you had in mind. Really difficult to sort of separate out what it could have been versus what it is as well. Really hard to see your own work on its own merits, I think, sometimes, until you've had that distance from it.
Right. That separation is so key. I've looked back at, read things that I wrote years ago that and seeing it and reading it, it's like, oh, like sometimes you get that little like, oh, who wrote this?
Who is this masked man?
Or like you can make yourself chuckle or, something like that. I think that's why it's so important to keep, I know you said you kind of trashed the first comics that you made. But
I haven't trashed them. I just haven't shown anyone.
Okay. So I think it is important then to kind of keep a library of your past work for both reasons. Like, first of all, to see how much you've progressed and to see that, like, okay, all this time and effort that I've been putting into this thing that I love, it's paying off because my taste has grown and my abilities have grown, but also to see, oh, look, I've created something great in the past, or, not great, but I've created something that has value.
I have created something awesome. Bow down before me.
I popped that wheelie perfectly. But
that man in the limousine was so impressed.
But
his monocle dropped into his martini or something.
By the way, did you know that they're retiring the Planters guy with the monocle?
What?
The Planters peanuts, the peanut guy.
Yeah.
They're retiring him at the Super Bowl. So I don't know if anybody will wear a monocle ever again. I think that's like the retirement of the monocle itself.
His service will not be forgotten.
Rest in peace.
Never forget.
But no, I think it is important to have those kind of gems that you can look back to, so you can see that, okay, I've been able to create something successful in the past. I can make something successful in the future as well.
Yeah, I think I agree to a point. I'm not going to disagree at all, because I think it is very important to be able to give yourself a measure. I think it's unhealthy to try and measure your ability versus someone else's. I think the only safe measure you have, the only consistent measure, is your ability against your own ability previously. But that said, when I started taking drawing seriously, I filled like dozens of sketchbooks with absolute crap. It was dreadful drawing, but I needed to get through it to get to the slightly better stuff, and then I needed to get through to that to get to the point where I'm, happy and confident with my drawing now. And a lot of those sketchbooks, I trashed them. I threw them away. I pulled the covers off and recycled them, because it was a bit like, it felt like I was taking like video footage of me jogging every morning instead of, filming the big race.
Right.
It was just a sort of workout, and it was to build up a level of fitness rather than to, be the main event. So I have got rid of a bunch of sketchbooks. I know I shouldn't say that. I get told off by people. What are we going to do about your legacy if you don't have this history? I'm like, well, you're not going to want to see it, because it is really dreadful. It's bad. It was someone really trying to find their voice and that natural way of working through getting it wrong over and over and over again. which is humbling. And I think it was a fun experience to set yourself free from that desire that you had. I had this desire to be good, and then all of this work that wasn't. And I knew that it always was going to be what it was going to be, to sort of snip that out of my life and have it gone forever. It was quite liberating. And so I feel now that when I approach a sketchbook, I hear people talk about the fright you get with a blank page, the white page syndrome where you sort of freeze. And I don't have that anymore. I call it page fright. I don't have that because I know that the worst that can happen is I'll throw it away. Like, that's the absolute worst. If I put a line in the wrong place, it really doesn't matter because I'll either just change the lines that come subsequently or I'll start again. And it's fun. It doesn't really matter. This is a source of entertainment for me. I haven't been bored in years. I just haven't, because anytime I do think, oh, what am I going to do now? I can decide to draw a cat inside a spaceship. Anything. I could draw a kid popping a wheelie. Anything I like, and I'm going to be consistently delighted by the process, if not the image.
Right. No, and I think that is an important addendum to make too, because I definitely promote the idea, especially when you're starting out and you already know the big void that there is and the skills that you have to learn, and all the crappy drawings that you have to make, or the crappy drafts that you have to write, or the crappy notes that you have to play.
Yep.
All that work that has to go in. It's sometimes overwhelming. And also for people that just have, blocks, creative blocks, it's just give yourself permission to write crap. Give yourself that promise that, okay, whatever I'm going to create in the next hour or 5 minutes or whatever it is, I'm going to throw directly into the garbage. I just need to get the muscles moving, the creative muscles, and actually the physical, my hand moving, to give yourself that permission then to create garbage. And then,
yes,
it's just going to see nothing but the waste paper basket.
Well, I think the saying, what's the saying? Experience is what you get when you don't get what you want. I think that's true. And I don't often get what I want when I'm drawing or when I'm thinking or editing or writing or whatever. But once you've got something that exists, you've got something that's editable. And then you can work on improving something that exists. It's really, really hard to improve something that doesn't. If it stays in your head, it's formless. It's a vapor that you can't grab hold of. So by doing that first version, the crappy version, you've turned it into something solid, and you can start chipping away at it. You can change the shape of it because it's solidified at that point. I think that's really, really important. Working with students for so long, you'd see people who would sit at the desk and just sort of, you could see them almost straining, trying to force out an idea. If I just, an idea, well, it never comes out that way. You can't just sort of force an idea, and you've got to get the first 19 crappy versions down, and then you've got to start, smushing them together and getting them to interrelate and, bounce off each other and have babies. And then you take their babies and smush them into different babies. And this is how ideas work. They're an ecosystem, and you've got to start mating them together and see what happens. And this all sounds really grubby now. But there's something quite delightful about working with ideas on a page that is, you get that dopamine hit. You get the sort of deep excitement about it when you start mating these ideas together and seeing what weird babies they've got. It's really exciting.
Yeah, no, I love that analogy. I really do, though, because it is so true. It is like a melding of ideas, and you need to start from somewhere. You need to start putting at least one idea down and seeing where it goes. And that being said, when you are creating your own personal work, not necessarily freelance work, but your books that you've made, how does that process work? Do you have an idea in your head that you've kind of developed for a long time, or is it just drawing a cat in a spaceship and then it becomes
I mean, the answer is yes to all of the above. I have methods to get myself through dry periods where I'm thinking, oh, I'm never going to have another idea again. My fingers don't work. Paper is difficult to draw on, and I don't know anything anymore, because we all have days like that. And so when I have a day where the voice in the back of your head says you can't do this anymore, you've got to try and find a way to trick yourself into doing it regardless. And so for me, I'll sort of mutter under my breath. I'll sort of narrate what I'm doing. I'm going to draw this here, and if I do that there, and then I'm going to maybe if I make the ears a bit bigger. And the process I found of I mean, I must look like a absolute lunatic, but I found that the process of verbalizing what I'm doing while I'm doing it doesn't, because there's a voice there already and it's my voice and it's just narrating what I'm doing, it doesn't give the insidious voice in the back of my head any breathing room. So it can't say, oh, you're doing that wrong. Oh, I wouldn't have done it that way. Oh gosh, why have you coloured that in that colour? This is dreadful. You know, that voice that's always with us. So on the bad days where it's particularly loud, you know, I'll narrate myself and I'll say, you know, okay, I'm going to draw the panel border. I'm just going to try and keep it as straight as I can. I'm going to take a right turn here and I'm going to go up and around there. And then I'm trying not to smudge this. And I'm going to turn the paper and I'll literally just explain to myself what I'm doing. And that's often just enough to, I mean, it's ridiculous as well. So you find yourself amusing and I find that my mood lifts at that point. I mean, in terms of where the ideas come from, there'll be, sort of walking around life, sort of taking things in and stopping and looking at things and, you know, looking at the roofs of buildings or the tops of door frames, the things that people don't often look at, and thinking about them in a way that you don't often think about them. It's not a way to have ideas, but it's like putting on a brand new hat and having a different brain as a result of it. So I'm always trying to think about the things around us and how we relate to them and why we do that. And this is always like, it's a little sort of analytical thing, like why did they build a roof in that way? Who would have done that? And asking myself these dumb questions that are kind of inconsequential, but it gets me into thinking about the details of people and stories and why things happen the way they do. For me, stories are causal. Something happens and therefore something happens, therefore something else happens, therefore we all come away feeling fulfilled at the end. And so examining the world and, you know, using roofs and door frames is like the lowest possible level of it. You know, you can work your way up to people and like look at their coats and jackets or shoes and, you know, the jewelry they wear on the fingers and start to imagine the worlds that existed to bring that person to that point. And you can take some of those real life elements and you can draw them into your sketchbook, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, this is a detective who's hunting someone who's always got their bum hanging out for some reason, which is a real thing. I did a book called Dick Rivets, which is the most ridiculous thing ever. But it all comes from a point of looking at the world and trying to make sense of it in some way. I'll wake up in the morning with an idea for something, or in the middle of the night, or I'll be in a hotel and something will just strike me and I have to write it down immediately, because if I don't write it down, it dribbles out of my ears while I sleep and then it's gone forever. So I'll have, you know, a little notebook or the notes app on my phone that is absolutely chock full of nonsense. You know, there'll be just little observations and the things I'll forget, and I'll return to it, you know, sort of periodically and think, there's a gem in there. I can pick the peanuts from this turd and that will become something. And occasionally an idea will sort of pop into your mind fully formed. I'm always very wary of them, because it might mean that it came from somewhere else and I've just forgotten where that was. So I'm wary of ideas that sort of present themselves as, here I am, I'm the finished thing, just draw me. Because I start to then question the authenticity of them. I feel like I've got to struggle a little with an idea. I've got to do the thing where I smush it together with a different one and see where it goes. And often you'll let yourself have an idea, you'll let it fill your brain, and then you'll do something else. You'll paddle a canoe up a river, and then while you're dragging something out of the back of the car, or, you know, shaking your feet off or whatever, a thing will occur to you because it's been laying at the bottom of your brain, sedimenting, like turning into some sort of, you know, limestone, sedimentary rock that becomes a bit more solid. And you have this immediate, I write this down. This is really exciting, because you've allowed yourself the chance for your brain to sort of work on it on autopilot. And it's always going to bring back something that was slightly unexpected. It's great fun. It is, yeah. And that, I'm glad you brought up Dick Rivets, because that's why I asked you that question too. Like, how do you get your ideas? But what you said is so true, and I think it should like be said over and over again, because I think, you know, that idea of putting the hat on and seeing the world in a different way, like the world needs creative people for that reason, like to see the world in a different way, and then to show you how you probably see the world in a different way too, like to make those connections. Like, it's so incredibly important to wear that hat as much as you possibly can, and that hat can be whatever it is for you, you know, like seeing the world in the way that only you can see it, embracing that, and
leaning into that?
Well, I think that stories are incredibly powerful because it's a way for a lot of people to experience a broader part of the world outside of their experience. You know, whether it's TV, podcasts, comics, films, books, internet forums, Twitter, whatever it is. These are all versions of a story. And we have to be very careful with the stories that we tell because I think that oftentimes they can be the thing that defines what normal is. And if it's normal that, you know, a certain subsection of society or the majority of people or, you know, this group of people are worse than, you know, the stories are incredibly powerful because they set for us what normal is. And normal is a really dangerous idea because it just arrives fully formed and we kind of just accept it. So we have to, I think, work with care in defining what normal is. It's a responsibility that you've got to take seriously, I think.
How about for you then, when your kind of normal is, you know, doing things like Dick Rivets, things that are like humorous in nature, that bring a laugh, that bring a chuckle, like even just talking about it, and then doing something like Carry Me, which is sad.
Yeah.
So what, like when you got the inspiration to do Carry Me, was there a hesitation because of the story that you told yourself or that maybe your audience has told you, like, you know, like, oh, I do comics that are humorous, and then kind of switching it up. And then what was that process like? Was there ever a hesitation? Yeah,
there was. I think because if people don't know, the way I draw is sort of loose and whimsical and sort of cartoony and funny, I think. That's kind of what I'm aiming for. It's got the ability to go darker and I can draw dark things, but I don't tend to get commissioned to do dark, serious stuff because I don't think my artwork tends to lend itself to that. It generally tends to lend itself towards comedy and whimsy, which is quite good for me because I'm kind of whimsical and fairly happy most of the time anyway. So, you know, that seems to be a nice fit. The book Carry Me, it wasn't long after my daughter was born. I should say she's fine, I'm fine, we're all fine. No one's died, we're all okay. But I think, you know, when I had kids, I've spoken to a lot of other parents about this, and I think there can be a tendency sometimes when you're presented with this brand new precious life to start obsessing on death. I know I did. I, you know, spent an awful lot of time thinking about mortality, you know, obviously with these terrible headaches that I would have. I got hospitalized around the same time with a suspected brain hemorrhage, which was very scary. Turned out to be okay. I'm fine. Everything's fine.
Good.
But I spent a week in hospital thinking that I might not come out again. So I had this in my head and thinking about the idea of, you know, mortality and who you leave behind and what happens to people, because that's essentially all we have left at the end, is that was where it came from. So the story, it's a wordless narrative about a girl who loses her father, essentially. That's it. And it's wordless, and I found that people could read into it in a lot of different ways. There was no text that anchored it to a specific, and because of that, the reader can fill in a lot of those blanks with their own experience and their own interpretation. And that was a deliberate choice, because if it became Dan talking about his daughter Elsa, then that became specific to me and it diminished the experience of anyone else. But I found that when I released it, there was a few people that were a little bit confused, like, well, this isn't very funny. And I think people have, you know, an expectation about who you are and what you do. People don't like, I think, the idea that you're more than one thing. I think certainly as like the persona that you present creatively, it becomes that one defining persona. So I'd done a lot of funny comics, and so my creative persona became the guy who does funny comics. Then, you know, my persona became teacher, so then it was like the guy who teaches comics. And it's difficult, I think, for people to have this vision of someone who does more than one thing. So, you know, I work as a designer, I design typefaces, I make pens, I draw comics, I produce a podcast, I do sort of teaching as well. And it's difficult. It's like people only accept a list of 3 things before they're like, you can't be that many different things. And it's the same in terms of the genres that you work in as well. If you have, you know, your favorite comedy writer doing, you know, a serious thing about cancer, for example, that isn't funny, people that they feel like they're tripped up out of that groove that they were in. Like, what's happening now? This isn't what I expected. So it's difficult to describe. And maybe it's only me that sees it because it's happening to me and it's the thing I think about a lot. But the artwork that you produce doesn't have to be a reflection of one aspect of your personality. It can do multiple things. And as long as it's sort of true and consistent and appealing, I guess, then I guess it's okay. But it's a strange thing. I'm not quite sure I know how to answer it, really.
Well, I think, no, you did a great job answering it. And because I just wanted to get your mindset, in the creation process, because I think that it is a common thing that trips people up when they get this inspiration to do something different, but they've told themselves this story of, you're a humor writer, so you can't possibly get serious, or
you're a teacher. What else could you do?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Or even switching, genres, or doing something different. Like, I'm a visual artist. Like, how could I possibly crochet or pick up an instrument or whatever? But like, I think these things are super important, because kind of like you were getting those headaches, like your body telling you that something isn't right. If your body's telling you, like, giving you this, like, these brain synapses that make you want to pick up a guitar, or makes you want to learn how to edit in Photoshop or whatever it is, even if it's something completely different than what you're used to doing, I think it's really important to listen to your body, your brain, your creative impulses, and go with it, regardless of what your audience is expecting, or what your family is expecting, or what you yourself are expecting, because then there's no chance for surprises.
There's got to be no guilty pleasures, just pleasures.
Just pleasures, yes.
Just pleasure.
Yeah, so I think that's super important.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm realizing that I'm keeping you long. Can I ask you one more question?
Yeah.
Because I can't let you go without asking you about drawing people as birds. Because when I saw this on your shop, I was like, bye. Like, I had to. So for people listening, like, you can go on Dan's store and just commission him to draw you as a bird, which I immediately snapped. Like, I took that opportunity. How did that start?
Okay, so I was at a comic show, and I was, in the floor plan layout, I was in a corner, and so a lot of the traffic that was coming around was cutting my corner, and so I was sort of sat there, a little bit forlorn, a little bit tired, and a little bit sad because no one was buying anything. So I decided I'll play a game with Twitter. So I put on Twitter, send me a picture of yourself, and I'll draw you as and I picked the word bird out of the air. I'll draw you as a bird. Why not? I didn't know if I could do it. I thought this would be a fun thing to do. And so people started sending me pictures of themselves, and I started drawing them as birds, and it went a bit nuts. And I had like hundreds of people. Now draw me. Now also draw. This is my wedding party. There's 40 of us. Draw us all as birds. Do it now. So it's, oh my goodness. So it's a super fun thing to do, because as long as you get the hair, the facial hair, or the, earrings or clothes or glasses or whatever, as long as you've got some key defining features, you can just turn them into a duck. And that's just incredible. So I love doing this in person with people. So at a comic show, if you come up and say, can you draw me as a bird? Like, yeah, I can. And I'll even charge you money for the pleasure. But genuinely, the pleasure is mine. This is all for me. This is, I don't care about the drawing. The process of, sitting with someone and going, okay, I'm going to draw you as a bird. Stop moving. Look this way, look that way. Yeah, I'm going to draw you as a bird. This is for me. Oh, it's so much fun. It's an obscene amount of fun.
See, that's cool.
I love it.
That's cool too, because I think that's really important to lean into those ideas. Obviously, it's not about the money, but now you provide this service that the world desperately needs. The world, people need to be drawn as a bird if they want to be drawn as a bird. No, but I think for people, you get this idea, if you have a little storefront, throw it on there. Or if, you don't want to do it for money, you just want to do it for fun, you have an hour to kill, put it up on Twitter. That's a great way to build your community too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or
so
your community, or your flock, I should say.
Flock. Oh, I love it. Yeah, I mean, doing I call it stunt drawing, So a thing where I'll draw sort of either in person or, within parameters. I was a cartoonist in residence at the Shrewsbury International Comedy Festival a few months ago, where I had to draw all of the acts while they were performing in the dark, in colour, and then, sort of sketch it and put it onto Instagram on the numerous different accounts, and then do a nice watercolour that was to be presented to them after they'd performed. And it was 11 in the morning till 1, 2 in the morning every day for 4 days. It was like life drawing, but in the dark without all your stuff, and the person wouldn't stop moving. It was really, really tough, but I get so much from it. It's so exciting to work doing something that you really enjoy within these restrictive parameters. So things like, drawing at a comedy festival or doing a 24-hour comic where you've got to draw 24 pages in 24 hours non-stop. In fact, tomorrow is Hourly Comics Day, where you've got to draw a page of comics for every hour that you're awake, which is so much fun. Trying to find an interesting thing in that hour to write about and draw about, and then get it done within the hour and put it on Twitter and get excited about it and see what everyone else is doing and lose your marbles because everyone else is better than you. I love it. I absolutely love it.
I actually did have that written down too, to ask you about the 24-hour comic that you did, and that experience. You stayed up for 24 straight hours?
Yeah, I've done a few of them.
Oh, you have?
Yeah, I think the first one I did was in France, in a town called Angoulême, where there's this giant comics festival. It's actually on at the moment, but this was maybe 10 years ago, where, we got to work in this artist residence and draw a 24-page comic in 24 hours. Because I work relatively quickly anyway, I've always finished early when I've done them, which feels pretty good. I think the most pages I did in one was 38 pages, in 24 hours. That was pushing it a bit. But it's great fun. It's really fulfilling to sit down one day with nothing, and then the same time the next day you've got an entire book. It's the most wonderful thing. It goes in waves. You start off very enthusiastic, and then once the sun's gone down and you're hungry and you're not sure what you're doing anymore and you're tired, you fall into a deep pit of despair at about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And then you gradually, as the sun comes up, you pull out of it and you're like, this is actually really good fun. It's brilliant. It's great fun. I'd recommend everyone to try it, but don't put too high an expectation on it, because no one's expecting it to be good because you literally did it in one day. Mm-hmm. Do it for the experience and the fun, I think.
It's also good practice, I think, to do something like that, because you go through all of the phases of the creative process. The super highs when you're starting, the lows in the middle, the inevitable lows, and then the highs again when you're finished, so that when you are doing something that's a little bit more long-term and you can't kind of see where you are on that timeline, you can look back to that day and be like, okay, this is just, hour 7. So I just got to get through this and I'll eventually, get to that point where I'm high again.
So the thing I find most exciting about it is it forces you to distill your process. And I'm sure this will, be transferable to other areas as well, but it forces you to distill your process to the most efficient and achievable version of it. And so if you have laborious thumbnails and then laborious pencils and then laborious artwork that's laboriously painted, a lot of the excess must be stripped away, and you get down to the absolute bare essentials of what you can achieve in the time that you have. And although it may not be to the standard that you'd like to see it realized at, it is at a standard where it is readable, achievable, done, finished. So you get an enormous sense of achievement from being able to do something in a day, but you learn so much about your own process and your own understanding of how you work, because everything gets magnified and condensed into its most distilled, purest form. The highs and the lows, but also the process and the actual storytelling as well. I love it. I've done a few of them, and I like doing them. It's a bit weird, but I enjoy that sort of stunt drawing thing.
Stunt drawing, stunt writing, stunt whatever. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Dan, this has been awesome, but it is time for the final push.
Okay.
And this is where I ask you to reach to the microphone and grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today, and just give them your best final words of advice and push them to pursue their own creative passions.
What you've got to do is don't aim to make this thing that you're working on right now the best thing ever, because it's crippling. If you're trying to make it perfect, perfection is unachievable. Aim to make the next one the really good one. But the next one is always the next one. You're never actually going to arrive there. Make the next one the perfect one. Aim for a B grade at this point. Just get it done. Something that exists is so much better than something that doesn't.
Awesome. Yes, definitely. Go for that B.
Half-ass it.
Half-ass it. Dan, dude, thank you so much for coming on the show today, for talking about your creative process, and for also creating such a great podcast yourself.
Thank you
very much. I appreciate all your insights, man.
And you too.
And for everybody listening, you can find Dan at makeitthenteleverybody.com.
That's the one.
And we'll have everything else we talked about today linked up at today's show notes page, yourcreativepush.com/342. Dan, thanks again, man.
Thank you so much.
Huge thank you to Dan once again for coming on the show. A million bajillion takeaways from this episode. You could probably go back and listen to this again and get some new insights from the things that you missed. And just a few things that I want to touch on really quickly before we let you go on your own creative day. Number one, that idea of when you're feeling stressed, paying attention to how you feel and noticing the indicators that occur before you really stress out. When you're working yourself too hard, or maybe working on something that you're not into, that's stressing you out, or you're bringing on too much work or too many things in your life, and your body is starting to give you signs that things are not going right, take note of those things so that something good can come out of that stressful situation, so that you can notice those indicators in the future and be able to pull back earlier than you let yourself go this time. Secondly, that BMX story, I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop actually talking about it in real life because I can so clearly see myself doing that when I was a kid. But it is so fundamentally true as well that I think we all have this idea that somebody is just going to notice us when we're just out on our sidewalk riding our bike, when we're just sitting in a coffee shop doing our art. It's not that easy. We have to be brave and put ourselves out there and be willing to promote ourselves and to be proud of our own work and to seek opportunities, even if that means the risk of failure. It's something we talk about a lot, but we need to be reminded of it. There's not that man in the limousine looking for the next kid that can pull off the perfect wheelie on your BMX bike. So start filming yourself doing those wheelies and putting yourself out there, metaphorically, of course. And then finally, finding that perfect level of effort that Dan was talking about, where you're not being lazy, but you're also not stressing yourself out. Like Dan said, a B. Aim for a B. But it's really important to not be confused here. A consistent B. Don't just aim for mediocre work. Aim for consistent, decent work. Not perfect work where you're getting an A+ or extra credit, but decent work, and decent work all the time, where you're putting up B after B after B after B instead of cramming and planning and thinking too hard and aiming for that A+. Remember, like Dan said, save perfect for later. You can always get that perfect A later. For now, just go for that decent work that you're consistently putting out and continue to actually put it out. And one final note, if you want to check out me as a bird, or at least Dan's version of me as a bird, I will be posting that on YouTube this week. Or you can actually head to yourcreativepush.com/youngmanbird to get there faster if you'd like. On next week's episode, we have Amelia Angelovska. Amelia is an artist who was born in Macedonia, raised in Canada, and currently lives in the Netherlands. And she has a podcast called Back to the Drawing Board, where she discusses anything that challenges the conventional methods, things, practices, or processes in the art world. She has a big focus on community, and that's what we talk about at length in next week's episode. If you want to check out her podcast, you can head to backtothedrawingboardpodcast.com, and we'll also have that linked up in today's show notes page, along with everything else we talked about with Dan at yourcreativepush.com/342. But that's all I've got for you today, so hopefully you were inspired to go and get your work done. So go and get it done, and remember to aim for those solid, consistent B's, because the universe deserves your creativity, and you are the universe. I love you all so much, and we'll see you next week if you need the push again. Bye.
Mr. Peanut, he spent his life bringing people together. I know he'd be happy that we are all together now.
Yeah.
What is happening?
What is that? Is that a baby nut?
Just kidding. I'm back. Where's my monocle?